The only recipe my late wife left without a single ingredient began with 3 names, 2 dates, and an address in a town 20 miles away. At the bottom of the card, in Eleanor's unmistakably careful handwriting, were 7 words that made no sense at all. Don't stop until the last family smiles again. I had spent 30 years watching her write recipes with military precision. She never wasted space, never crossed out measurements, and never confused instructions. So why would the final card in her recipe box contain everything except food? If you've ever discovered that someone you loved carried a kindness you never knew about, stay with me. I turned the card over, hoping another recipe had simply been written on the back. It was blank. No flour, no butter, no oven temperature. Nothing except the yellowed paper that smelled faintly of cinnamon and the lavender sachets Eleanor tucked into every kitchen drawer. 3 weeks had passed since we buried her. The house was still full of casseroles from neighbors who meant well, and silence from the people who didn't know what to say anymore. My son, Michael, stood across the kitchen, sorting donation boxes. "You found Grandma's famous pie recipe yet?" he asked with a tired smile. "Not exactly." He looked up as I handed him the mysterious card. He read it once, then again. Finally, he shrugged. "I think the chemo got to her toward the end." I took the card back before he could say anything else. "No," I answered quietly. "Your mother didn't write by accident." Before retiring, I had spent 26 years as an Army medic. My job had never been to guess. It had been to notice the tiny details everyone else dismissed until they suddenly mattered. Eleanor had always admired that about me. She used to joke that I could diagnose a broken coffee maker just by listening to it for 30 seconds. More importantly, I knew her handwriting as well as I knew my own heartbeat. Every letter on that card was deliberate. Every comma sat exactly where she intended. The address belonged to a place neither Michael nor I recognized. The first name listed was Helen Carter. The date beside it was nearly 12 years old. The final line simply read, "Take the blue envelope first." "Blue envelope?" Michael asked. I opened the wooden recipe box again. Beneath dozens of handwritten recipes for cornbread, peach cobbler, chicken soup, and Christmas cookies enresented one small blue envelope I had somehow missed. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a folded note. "Daniel, you always told me that healing doesn't end when the bandages come off. I believed you. Please finish what I couldn't. Love always, Eleanor." My throat tightened. There was nothing else inside. No explanation. No map. No instructions beyond the address already written on the card. Michael watched me carefully. "Dad, you don't actually plan to drive across 3 towns chasing something Mom wrote while she was sick, do you?" I looked again at Eleanor's recipe box resting on the kitchen table. For 35 years, every meal she prepared had brought people together. Maybe this final recipe was supposed to do the same. I slipped the card and the blue envelope into my jacket pocket. "I think," I said quietly, reaching for my truck keys, "your mother just gave me one last house call." The drive to Helen Carter's address took just under 40 minutes, but it felt much longer because every mile gave me another chance to wonder whether Michael had been right. Grief can make ordinary things look like messages. I'd seen it happen to families after battlefield losses. A forgotten voicemail became a prophecy. An old receipt became a treasure map. But Eleanor had never confused sentiment with purpose. If she wanted me somewhere, there would be a reason. Helen's house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees that had already surrendered most of their autumn leaves. It was modest, white, and carefully maintained. A small wooden ramp led to the front porch, and fresh chrysanthemums flanked the door. I knocked once. An elderly woman answered almost immediately. She studied my face for several seconds before her expression softened. "You must be Daniel." The words stopped me cold. "You were expecting me?" She smiled sadly. "I've been expecting you for almost 3 years." Helen invited me inside before I could ask another question. The living room walls were covered with family photographs, but one picture near the fireplace caught my attention. Eleanor stood beside Helen, both women laughing while holding paintbrushes in front of what looked like a newly renovated bedroom. "I've never seen that picture," I admitted. "Haven't you?" Helen asked gently. She always said she preferred doing good things quietly. She disappeared into another room and returned carrying a small tin box. "I've been keeping this for you." Inside were several folded thank you notes tied together with green ribbon. The first one came from a young widow whose home had burned down. The second was from grandparents raising 2 grandchildren after their daughter died. The third thanked Eleanor for organizing volunteers to repair a leaking roof before winter. None of the letters mentioned money. Everyone mentioned time, listening, showing up, bringing people together. I looked up at Helen. I didn't know she did any of this. That was exactly how Eleanor wanted it. Helen reached beneath the stack and removed one faded envelope addressed to me. "I offered to mail it after she passed." "Why didn't you?" "Because she told me not to." I unfolded the letter carefully. "Daniel, the first stop isn't meant to answer your questions. It's meant to change them. Don't ask how many people I helped. Ask why they all knew where to find one another afterward. You'll understand at the second address." I turned the page over. On the back, Eleanor had written another name. Samuel Ortiz. Another town. Another date. Another direction. Helen noticed me reading. She visited Samuel every Christmas Eve. What happened to him? Helen smiled, but her eyes filled with tears. That's his story to tell. As I slipped the letter into the blue envelope, something else slid onto the table. A small laminated recipe card. It wasn't for food. Across the top, Eleanor had written, "Ingredients for hope one listening ear." One honest introduction. One table with room for another chair. I stared at those words far longer than I should have. Michael thought Eleanor's final recipe had been unfinished. Standing in Helen's living room, I began to realize it wasn't unfinished at all. I simply hadn't recognized what she had been teaching herself to make. As I thanked Helen and walked back toward my truck, my phone rang. It was Michael. "Dad," he said without even saying hello, "I think I found something hidden underneath the bottom of Mom's recipe box." I drove home with Eleanor's letter resting on the passenger seat, as though it deserved its own place in the truck. During 26 years as an Army medic, I'd learned that every successful recovery depended on recognizing patterns before everyone else did. Eleanor wasn't asking me to solve a mystery. She was teaching me to recognize one. By the time I reached our driveway, I no longer believed the recipe box contained random memories. It contained a sequence. Michael was waiting on the front porch with the wooden recipe box resting on his lap. "I almost threw it away," he admitted. "The bottom felt loose, so I checked." He lifted the felt lining. Hidden underneath was a folded county road map with 3 tiny blue circles drawn by hand. Helen Carter, Samuel Ortiz, and one final location that had been covered by another piece of paper for so many years, the ink beneath it had barely faded. The third town was nearly 70 miles away. "I still think Mom was organizing something," Michael said. "Maybe a church project. I thought that this morning. And now? I don't think this was ever about projects." I carefully unfolded the map. A small pencil note in Eleanor's handwriting ran along one edge. "Always finish one visit before starting the next. People aren't destinations. They're bridges." Michael frowned. "What does that even mean?" "I don't know yet." That answer surprised both of us. For the first time since Eleanor died, I admitted I didn't have one. Instead of leaving immediately for Samuel Ortiz's address, I did something Michael didn't expect. I made coffee. I sat quietly at the kitchen table. I reread every note, every name, every date, every margin. Years in emergency medicine had taught me another lesson. Rushing into the wrong diagnosis could be more dangerous than waiting one more hour for the right one. If Eleanor wanted these visits completed in order, she had a reason. I called Helen. "Did Eleanor ever tell you how she found Samuel?" There was a brief silence. "No," Helen answered, "but she asked me to give you this if you called before visiting him." She laughed softly. "I suppose she knew exactly how your mind worked." An hour later, I returned to Helen's house. She handed me an old Polaroid photograph. Samuel stood beside Eleanor outside a community center, both smiling beside a long folding table covered with homemade meals. Written on the back was one sentence: "He only trusted strangers after someone introduced them." That changed everything. The families weren't connected by money. They were connected by introductions. One act of trust leading to another. One healed relationship making the next one possible. Driving toward Samuel's town, I finally understood why Eleanor had written that people were bridges. She hadn't been helping isolated families. She had been quietly building a chain that stretched across years. As afternoon sunlight settled across the highway, I turned into a modest neighborhood where children rode bicycles between maple trees. Samuel's address was a small brick house with an American flag hanging beside the garage. Before I could knock, the front door opened. A gray-haired man studied me carefully. Then his eyes settled on the blue envelope sticking out of my jacket pocket. His shoulders slowly relaxed. "Eleanor finally sent you," he said. I nodded. "I'm Daniel." Samuel smiled with unmistakable relief. "I've been praying you'd arrive before Carol sold her house." I felt the ground shift beneath the investigation once again. For the second time in 2 days, someone already knew I was coming. And for the first time, I realized Eleanor hadn't simply planned a trail of clues. She had prepared people to continue the recipe long after she was gone. Samuel Ortiz welcomed me into his home with the kind of quiet certainty usually reserved for old friends, even though we'd never met. His living room carried the unmistakable signs of a life rebuilt instead of inherited. The furniture didn't match. The picture frames came from different decades. Yet everything was spotless, carefully arranged, and unmistakably loved. Eleanor would have noticed that before she noticed anything else. She always believed the way people cared for ordinary things revealed how hard they'd fought to keep going. "You've already met Helen," Samuel said as he poured coffee. I nodded. "She gave me more questions than answers." He smiled. "That's because Eleanor never wanted people chasing information. She wanted them following people." Those words settled into my mind harder than I expected. Samuel disappeared into a hallway and returned carrying a weathered 3-ring binder. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten thank you cards, volunteer schedules, church potluck sign-up sheets, and photographs spanning almost 15 years. At first they looked unrelated. Then I noticed the names: Helen Carter, Robert and June Ellis, the Harrison twins, Linda Brooks. Every person appeared somewhere else later, volunteering beside another family. No one simply received help. Each eventually became someone who offered it. Samuel watched my expression change. "You're seeing it now. Eleanor wasn't building a charity. No." He gently closed the binder. "She was building neighbors." That single sentence completely changed the investigation. I had assumed Eleanor's final recipe honored isolated acts of kindness. Instead, she'd created something far more enduring. Every family she'd helped eventually became the beginning of someone else's healing. The recipe wasn't charity. It was multiplication. Samuel reached into the binder once more and removed a folded calendar page. A single date had been circled in blue ink. 3 days from now. "What happens then?" I asked. "Carol Benton signs the papers to leave town. The last name." He nodded. "Once she leaves, the chain breaks." I frowned. "I still don't understand why." Samuel leaned back quietly before answering. "Because Carol doesn't know she belongs to it." He explained that Carol's husband had died suddenly nearly a decade earlier, leaving her overwhelmed with debt, grief, and 2 frightened children. Eleanor never solved those problems herself. Instead, she introduced Carol to people who had survived similar losses. Those introductions eventually led to childcare, job opportunities, home repairs, and lifelong friendships. "But Carol believed it all happened naturally," Samuel said. "Eleanor wanted it that way?" "She believed gratitude grows stronger when it belongs to people instead of heroes." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Samuel handed me one final envelope. Across the front, Eleanor had written only one instruction: "Open only after you choose to continue." I turned the envelope over in my hands. I could have opened it immediately. Instead, I slipped it into my jacket pocket, unopened. Samuel smiled. "Good. You knew I wouldn't?" I hoped. Years in the army had taught me something Osino people never needed to learn. The right information at the wrong moment could become a distraction instead of guidance. Eleanor hadn't hidden this envelope because she enjoyed mysteries. She wanted me to make one decision without depending on her. "I'll finish this," I said. "I know." Before I left, Samuel walked me to the front porch. "There is one more thing." "What is it?" "Carol put her house on the market because she believes no one would notice if she disappeared." The words struck harder than anything else I'd heard. Driving away, I finally understood the true deadline. This was no longer about honoring Eleanor's memory. It was about preventing one more family from believing they had always been alone. I waited until I reached a quiet rest area before opening the envelope Eleanor had trusted me to earn instead of inherit. The parking lot overlooked a small lake where the afternoon wind pushed ripples across the water, and for a long moment I simply held the envelope in my hands. During my years as an Army medic, I had learned that some moments demanded action, while others demanded stillness. Eleanor had always understood the difference. She knew I wouldn't truly hear her final words until I chose this journey for myself. Inside was a single handwritten page. Daniel, if you're reading this, you've already discovered that kindness cannot survive if it depends on only one person. Every family you visit knows only part of the story. None of them know they became part of someone else's beginning. Please don't tell them everything yet. Let them meet one another first. Folded beneath the letter was a list of names. I immediately recognized several from Samuel's binder. Each name had a small blue check mark beside it. Only one remained unchecked. Carol Benton. At the bottom, Eleanor had written another sentence. The recipe isn't complete until she knows she was never rescued alone. She belongs to the family she unknowingly helped create. I leaned back in my seat, finally understanding why Eleanor had hidden the truth from everyone. Recognition would have ended the chain. Connection had allowed it to grow. When I returned home that evening, Michael was waiting in the kitchen. "You've been gone all day," he said. "I know. So, were we wrong about Mom?" I looked toward the recipe box resting on the counter. "No." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "We were wrong about what she was doing." I spread the map, the letters, and the photographs across the kitchen table. For nearly an hour, I explained everything Helen and Samuel had shared. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, he rubbed both hands across his face. "I never knew any of this." "Neither did I." He stared at one photograph of Eleanor laughing beside complete strangers. "I thought she was volunteering." So did everyone else. The silence between us no longer felt heavy. It felt respectful. Finally, Michael spoke again. "What do you need from me?" It was the first time since Eleanor's funeral that he hadn't tried to convince me to stop searching. "I need help finding everyone." The next morning, we visited the county library, where Samuel had suggested we speak with Grace Nolan, the head librarian. Grace remembered Eleanor immediately. Instead of checking out novels, Eleanor had spent years reserving meeting rooms, community bulletin boards, genealogy records, and local directories. Grace opened an old scheduling ledger. Every 6 months, Eleanor had quietly reserved the same small meeting room. Different names appeared each time, different families, different volunteer groups. Never the same combination twice. Grace smiled as she traced one finger down the faded pages. I always wondered why none of those people seemed to know each other when they arrived. "And afterward?" I asked. "They left talking like old friends." As Grace photocopied the reservation logs, one final entry caught my attention. Tomorrow. Community Hall. Reserved by Eleanor Ross. Cancelled after her hospitalization. My pulse quickened. The chain had one final missing gathering. Carol was scheduled to move away the day after tomorrow. For the first time since opening the recipe box, failure became a real possibility. If I couldn't bring everyone together before Carol left, Eleanor's final recipe would remain unfinished, Not because she had run out of time, but because I had. The canceled reservation at the community hall changed everything. Until that moment, I believed I was following Eleanor's footsteps. Now I understood she had been walking several steps ahead of me all along. She hadn't simply hoped I would discover her final recipe. She had designed it so I could complete it only if I stopped trying to understand her and started trusting her. During my years as an army medic, the hardest lesson I ever learned was that healing rarely happened because one person worked harder. It happened because people chose to carry one another. Michael and I spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls. Helen agreed to come without asking why. Samuel simply said, "It's finally time." Grace offered to help prepare the meeting room. By sunset, 8 families had promised to attend. Only Carol hadn't answered. Every call went directly to voicemail. By early evening, I drove to the small house Samuel had pointed out on a hand-drawn map. A moving truck sat in the driveway. Half-filled cardboard boxes were stacked neatly across the front porch, and a real estate sign leaned against the garage wall, waiting to be collected after the closing. I hesitated before knocking. A tired-looking woman opened the door. She couldn't have been much older than 60, yet grief had added years that time alone never could. "Mrs. Benton?" She nodded cautiously. "I'm Daniel Ross. I don't believe we've met. No." I reached into my jacket, but stopped before taking out Eleanor's letter. Something inside me said this wasn't the moment. Instead, I introduced myself exactly as Eleanor would have wanted. "Helen Carter asked me to stop by." Carol's expression softened almost immediately. "Helen?" "And Samuel Ortiz." She blinked in surprise. "You know Samuel?" "I do now." For the first time, curiosity overcame caution. She invited me inside. The living room looked strangely familiar, not because I'd ever visited before, but because it reminded me of dozens of military families I'd met after difficult deployments. Everything valuable had already been packed. Only memories remained on the walls. Carol poured 2 glasses of iced tea before quietly asking, "Why are all these people suddenly finding me again?" I smiled gently. "I think they've been trying to find one another." She looked confused. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated. Michael. His voice sounded unusually tense. "Dad, someone broke into the house." My heart sank. The recipe box? Gone. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Every letter, every photograph, every handwritten note Eleanor had left. Gone. Michael continued. "The sheriff thinks it was probably a random burglary." I looked around Carol's quiet living room. No. It didn't feel random. Not after everything Eleanor had planned. Not after someone had waited until the exact day we gathered the families. I apologized to Carol and drove home immediately. The back kitchen window had been forced open. Several drawers had been emptied onto the floor. Oddly, the television remained untouched. The silverware was still there. Nothing valuable appeared missing except the recipe box. The responding deputy shook his head. "Strangest burglary I've seen this month." Michael stood silently beside me. I should have stayed here. No. I looked around the room one more time. Whoever had taken the box believed the investigation depended on the papers. They didn't realize the most important evidence no longer lived inside that wooden box. It lived inside the people Eleanor had spent 15 years bringing together. As I closed the broken window against the cool evening air, one question refused to leave my mind. If someone wanted the recipe box badly enough to steal it now, who had finally realized what Eleanor had actually created? I barely slept that night. Not because the recipe box had been stolen, but because whoever took it believed they had erased Eleanor's legacy. They couldn't have been more mistaken. During 26 years as an army medic, I learned that records mattered, but people mattered more. Medical charts could disappear, buildings could burn, equipment could fail. Yet when enough people remembered the same act of compassion, the truth survived every disaster. Eleanor had spent 15 years making sure her final recipe lived inside human hearts instead of wooden boxes. By sunrise, Michael and I were already at the community hall. Grace had unlocked the building before dawn. Helen arrived carrying homemade muffins. Samuel rolled in 2 folding carts full of coffee urns and paper cups. Nobody complained about the stolen recipe box. Instead, they quietly arranged tables exactly as Eleanor used to. It was as though every one of them already understood what needed to happen. By mid-morning, the room slowly filled. Families who had never realized they shared a history introduced themselves awkwardly. One conversation led to another. A widow recognized the couple who had repaired her porch years earlier. A young father discovered that the woman who had helped him find his first apartment had once been helped by Helen. Every story connected to another. Every introduction revealed a bridge Eleanor had built years before. Standing near the doorway, I finally understood why she'd never wanted credit. If people believed Eleanor had solved every problem, they would remember only her. Instead, they were remembering one another. Then Carol walked in. She stopped after only 3 steps. The room fell unusually quiet. She looked from face to face with obvious confusion. "I know some of you," Helen smiled. "You know more of us than you think." For nearly an hour, no one gave Carol an explanation. They simply shared their stories, one after another. No speeches, no ceremony, just ordinary people describing the day someone unexpected had introduced them to another family exactly when they needed hope most. Slowly, Carol's expression changed. She wasn't hearing separate memories anymore. She was hearing a single story told from different directions. Finally, she turned toward me. "Was Eleanor doing this?" I nodded. She believed neighbors could outlive grief better than heroes could. Tears filled Carol's eyes. "I thought I survived because I got lucky." "No." Samuel spoke gently. "You survived because someone refused to let you face it alone." At that moment, the rear doors opened again. A sheriff's deputy stepped inside carrying something wrapped in a brown evidence bag. "The burglary suspect abandoned this behind an old storage building," he said. Inside the clear plastic sat Eleanor's recipe box. The lock had been forced open. The papers were gone. For one painful second, I felt my chest tighten. Then Helen laughed softly. "So that's all they took?" I looked at her, confused. She smiled around the room. "Daniel!" She gestured toward every family gathered there. "They stole the copies." The room became perfectly still. "The originals," she continued, touching her heart, "are all here." I finally understood. The recipe box had never been the evidence. It had only pointed toward it. The real proof had spent years walking, talking, grieving, healing, and quietly carrying Eleanor's kindness into lives she would never personally see. Looking across the crowded hall, I realized the investigation was over. The mystery had been solved long before I ever opened the first envelope. All I had really done was bring the finished recipe back to the same table where it had always belonged. A week after the gathering, the sheriff called to tell me they had identified the teenager who stole Eleanor's recipe box. He admitted the break-in wasn't personal. The boy had been looking for valuables he could sell, and when he discovered the box contained nothing but old papers, he abandoned it behind a storage building. The missing letters were scattered by the wind across an empty field. Some were recovered. Others were gone forever. Strangely, hearing that brought me peace instead of disappointment. Eleanor had never trusted paper to carry the weight of kindness forever. She had trusted people. Carol canceled the sale of her house, not because she suddenly feared leaving town, but because she finally understood she wasn't leaving strangers behind. She was leaving family. Not family by blood, family by choice. Over the following months, something remarkable happened without anyone announcing it. Helen began hosting monthly dinners again. Samuel organized volunteers to repair homes for widows and elderly neighbors. Grace turned one corner of the library into a community bulletin board where people could quietly ask for help or offer it without embarrassment. Michael surprised me most of all. One afternoon, he carried the repaired recipe box into my workshop. "I couldn't replace the scratches," he said. "I didn't want you to." He smiled. "I know." Instead of filling it with recipes, we placed inside photographs from the gathering, handwritten notes from every family, and one blank recipe card. I looked at Michael. "What should we write on it?" He handed me Eleanor's favorite fountain pen. "Whatever the next family needs." Months later, my grandchildren visited for Sunday dinner. They opened the old recipe box, expecting cookies and pie recipes, just as I once had. Instead, they found stories, names, photographs, acts of kindness. The youngest looked up at me and asked, "Grandpa, where's the recipe?" I smiled and pointed toward the dining room, where neighbors and friends were already pulling extra chairs up to the table. "You're sitting in it." If Eleanor taught me anything, it was that the finest recipes were never measured in cups or teaspoons. They were measured by the number of people who left your table believing they no longer had to face tomorrow alone. And if this story reminded you of someone whose quiet kindness changed a life without asking for recognition, I'd love for you to share that memory in the comments. Stories like these deserve to keep traveling from one heart to another. If you'd like to hear more stories of family, dignity, and quiet courage, you're always welcome here at Quiet Valor Stories. Wherever you are today, may your home always have room for one more chair, your heart remain open to unexpected neighbors, and may the kindness you receive become the kindness you quietly pass on to someone else. Until next time, take good care of yourself and the people who make your table feel like home.